Hi everybody, and welcome to this second Connect Group teaching in our series WWJS, What Would Jesus Say? And in this series we're dealing with some of life's biggest issues, like these ones behind me here, some of life's biggest practical issues, and we're dealing with them through the lens of what Jesus had to say about them. You know, Jesus only ministered for 3 years, and yet his teaching has transcended 2,000 years, and his words are just as practical and just as wise today for us as they were for the disciples and the crowds that heard him preach them for the very first time as he walked the shores of Galilee and taught in Jerusalem 2,000 years ago. And so we have been unpacking some of that and looking at how it can be helpful. And today I want to follow on from a message that we preached on the 19th of April, a couple of weeks back, in church, where we talked about offense and conflict and how to resolve it. And this issue was big enough that it could have its own series, but I just wanted to allocate two different opportunities to it. So once on a Sunday and once here in Connect Group, where we can deal with this because it's such a big part of our lives. Let me just review a little bit about what I said in the teaching on the Sunday. If you were there, it's good to hear it again. In fact, in a moment, I'm just going to basically unpack one of the passages a second time that we looked at. But if you didn't hear it, it'll give you an opportunity to hear it now. Let me tell you a little bit about offense. Jesus talks about offenses in life and how do we deal with those. And the word offense we talked about is a Greek word that we translate offense, which is actually the word scandalon. And it's the word that we get scandal from. So an offense becomes a scandal. And the word actually means, it was a word that was used for a trap or a snare that you would trap an animal with. So an offense is actually like a trap that the enemy sets for you. If you're going to get offended, you've actually put your foot in a trap and you've been snared. And Jesus says, beware of offenses. Beware of those traps. Don't put your feet into a trap of the enemy by taking offense. And there's an interesting term just right there. Isn't it interesting that we say we take offense? You don't give offense, we say we take it. You see, someone might offend you, but you have a choice as to whether to take that offense onto yourself or not. And so we talked about that, and we're going to come back to that in a moment. I wanted to just look at it from a slightly different perspective and talk about conflict, which it really is where offenses come from. But conflict in and of itself is not bad. How we deal with conflict determines whether it's good or bad. Conflict can actually be a good thing if you use it well. But if you take offense from conflict, then it has incredible destructive powers in your life. And we looked at that in that message the other week. You're going to have conflict in your life. There is no way around it. The only way to avoid conflict would be to lock yourself up as a hermit and go and live up in the mountain in a cave. And even then, I pretty much guarantee you'll have conflict with yourself because we disagree with ourselves all the time. Conflict is essentially unavoidable, and that's why Jesus has so much to say about it. But remember that conflict's not bad. It's how you deal with conflict that makes it bad or good. I just wanted to list a few things that the scriptures say about conflict, and I'm taking some of this teaching out of some stuff that I do with the pre-marriage course and marriage course that we've written, because it's applicable not just to married couples, but it's applicable to any area of relationship with your children or a workmate or a colleague or a neighbor or someone who you may have conflict with. So what do the scriptures have to say about conflict and communicating and so on? Proverbs 18 verse 13 says, "He who answers before listening, that is his folly and shame." And you know what it's like. If you feel offended, you tend to, like me, you tend to jump in and answer without listening. That's Jesus saying. The Proverbs are saying that's to your folly and shame when you do that. Proverbs 25 verse 12, "Like an earring of gold or an ornament of fine gold is a wise man's rebuke to a listening ear." James 1:19, "My dear brothers, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry." Proverbs 11:9, "With his mouth the godless destroys his neighbor, but through knowledge the righteous escape." Proverbs 12:18, "Reckless words pierce like a sword, but the tongue of the wise brings healing." Proverbs 15:4, "The tongue that brings healing is a tree of life, but a deceitful tongue crushes the spirit." Proverbs 10:19, "When words are many, sin is not absent, but he who holds his tongue is wise." Proverbs 13:3, he who guards his lips guards his life, but he who speaks rashly will come to ruin. There's a common theme you can see here, isn't there? It's very obvious. It's don't use this, use this. He's saying the more you listen and the less you speak, the more wise you'll be, the more successful you'll be, the more you'll deal effectively with conflict. The scriptures are full of this principle. My pastor used to say to me, Rowan, you've been given 2 ears and 1 mouth and you should use them in that proportion. And I've never forgotten that because I think that's wise. Problem is I ain't very good at it. I am a mouth. I tend to shoot from the hip and speak more than I should, like I'm doing right now. But that's just my personality, and it's a personal thing for me to learn to listen more than I speak. And so I'll put my hand up and say, this is a challenge for me to do this. And I know the times that I do it well, and I do listen and not speak as much, are the times when I resolve conflict, whether it's with Jill or my kids or somebody else. I resolve conflict more effectively when I put these principles into place. But when I don't, it usually escalates. And so this is a journey that I'm on. We're all on this. Jesus acknowledges that conflict is inevitable, but he does provide very practical tips on how to resolve it. And we talked about this a couple of weeks ago, and let me go there again. We're going to look at Jesus' teaching in Matthew chapter 18, verses 21 to 35, where Peter comes to Jesus and asks a question about conflict, and Jesus answers it. It says, Peter came to Jesus and asked, Lord, how often should I forgive someone who sins against me? 7 times? Jesus was asking Jesus, and what you need to understand here is that 7 was like the number of perfection. So Peter's quite proud of himself. He said, well, Lord, if someone hurts me and offends me, if I forgive them 7 times, surely that's enough. Surely that's plenty. You know, I've forgiven them once, I've forgiven them twice, I've forgiven them 7 times. Surely I'm a righteous man for doing that. And it was almost like he was boasting in that. But Jesus replied, no, Pete, not 7 times, but 70 times 7. You see, Jesus always raises the bar. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says, you've heard that it was said, do not commit murder. But I tell you, if you're angry with your brother, you've committed murder. You've heard that it was said, do not commit adultery. But I tell you, if you look lustfully at another person, you've committed adultery. Jesus raises the bar. He says, forgiveness is not something you do 7 times. It's something you need to do 70 times 7. Which, of course, is just like explaining the level of it. It's not like we go 70 times 7, okay? That's 490. So I'm going to forgive you 490 times, but on the 491st, right, that's it, you're done. No more. That's not what Jesus is saying. I mean, if you're counting how many times you've forgiven a person, then you haven't really forgiven them, have you? So Jesus is elevating the bar, and he does it. He illustrates the point by telling a story. And it's great wisdom of Jesus to do this. And he illustrates to Peter, he says, therefore, the kingdom of heaven can be compared to a king who decided to bring his accounts up to date with his servants who had borrowed money from him. In the process, one of his debtors was brought in who owed him millions of dollars. He couldn't pay, so his master ordered that he be sold along with his wife, his children, and everything he owned to pay a debt. Now, if you don't know this story, you need to understand that we are that person. We are the one who owed the master millions of dollars. So once you understand that, you put yourself in that story, in that part of the story, then you realize that Jesus is speaking to you and I. We are the ones who owed a massive debt. It's an impossible debt, if you like, for us to ever be able to deal with. There's no way that we could possibly hope to cover that debt. He couldn't pay, so his master ordered that he be sold along with his wife, his children, and everything he owed to pay the debt. But the man fell down before the master and he begged him and he said, please be patient with me and I'll pay it all. Now remember, there's no hope. It was impossible for him to pay this, but he's begging for his life. He's saying, please, I'll pay it all. And the master was filled with pity for him. He released him and forgave his debt. But when the man left the king, he went to a fellow servant who owed him a few $1,000s. He grabbed him, seized him by the throat, and demanded instant payment. His fellow servant fell down and begged him for a little more time. Be patient with me and I will pay it. In other words, he did exactly the same thing to this man had done to his master. But his creditor wouldn't wait. He had the man arrested and put in prison until the debt could be paid. Just pause there for a moment. I want to show you a couple of things. The debt that Jesus said that man owed the master was millions of dollars. The debt that person who had offended us was thousands of dollars. The first thing I want you to know is that Jesus isn't trivializing what's been done to you. Jesus isn't saying it was like, oh, they owed you 5 cents. No, this was still a significant debt. For most of us, I would say probably most of you, all of you watching this, thousands of dollars is a lot of money. It's a substantial debt. It's not something you can just go, yeah, don't worry about it. It's a substantial debt. Jesus isn't trivializing the hurt that has been done to you. Some people may have done some things to you which has grieved you and caused you tremendous heartache and tremendous pain. And Jesus doesn't dismiss that offhandedly. He's not saying, oh, that's worth 5 cents. He acknowledges that it's worth a significant amount of money. Now, these renderings in the New Living Translation are brought up into modern day, millions of dollars and thousands of dollars. But if you look at it in the original Greek, it's still very much the same. In fact, it's probably billions of dollars, the amount that we owe the Father, the Master. But he's still saying it's a significant debt. I think I did some sums on this, and the debt that Jesus is referring to is about 3 months worth of the average wage. So it is thousands of dollars. So Jesus is saying people have offended us to the equivalent of 3 months. Now, if you've been offended or someone's robbed 3 months of your wage, that's significant. So Jesus, that's the first thing. Jesus isn't trivializing it. But second, I want you to see that the difference between how much we owe the Master and how much we are owed is miles apart. It's not insignificant, but the difference is miles apart. So it all has to do with what debt you're looking at and what debt you're viewing your debt through. So if you're viewing the debt that has been done to you in comparison to the debt that you have done to the Master, to the Father, then it begins to take on a different perspective. So he threw this man into prison until he could pay it all. When some of the other servants saw this, they were very upset. They went to the king and told him what had happened. And the king called the man in, the man he had forgiven in, and he said, "You evil servant, I forgave that tremendous debt because you pleaded with me. Shouldn't you have had mercy on your fellow servant just as I had on you?" You see, when we grasp how much our Father has forgiven us, it makes it a heck of a lot easier to forgive other people. But if we start to think of ourselves as not having a debt, if we lose sight of just how much the grace of God has touched our lives, then we will put our eyes on the thousands of dollars, the 3-month wage, and we will see that as significant, and that will become the benchmark. And so we will harbour that on the inside, and it'll be very hard to release and forgive that person. So a key to learning to forgive and overcome conflict is to recognise and keep your eyes on how much God has forgiven you, how much God has forgiven me. That's what Jesus is teaching in this story. The more we focus on how much we've been forgiven, the more effective we'll be at forgiving other people. Now let's talk a little bit about conflict. As I said, conflict is not in and of itself a bad thing. It's how we treat conflict, how we deal with conflict that determines whether it's a good thing or a bad thing in our life. And I just thought I'd share some thoughts that I've written into our pre-marriage and our marriage course that we've done from time to time. So this stuff's predominantly dealing with spouses and conflict in a marriage, but it's applicable to all relationships wherever you might find conflict and disagreement, if you like. Now, as I said, disagreement, conflict, dare I say offence, none of those things in and of themselves are destructive. It's how you treat it, how you deal with it, how you focus after the conflict has taken place that determines whether or not it is a positive source in your life or a negative source. And if you deal with it well, it can actually strengthen your relationship. Actually, if you've had conflict with somebody and you've resolved it, your relationship can be stronger than it was before the conflict came. And it kind of sounds counterintuitive, but if we learn how to resolve it, it actually means that that relationship has been in a dark time and has come out of it and is actually stronger for it. And so the key is your communication, is how you communicate after conflict. If we employ good communication skills, then we'll bring about conflict resolution, which will actually serve to build relationship up. But if we have bad communication skills, that will lead to arguments and offences and problems escalating and tension and unforgiveness and all that stuff, which obviously ultimately destroys relationships and makes us feel a lot worse on the inside. So when conflict arises, we have a few choices as to how we can deal with it. And the first one is we can withdraw. This method fails to bring about resolution because When one or both parties withdraw, communication cannot continue. Problems may be bottled up inside. Resentment and bitterness will increase, and love will begin to decrease. The only time that withdrawal may be useful is a short period of time in order to get your head together and think about it, so that when you do actually bring up an issue and work on the conflict, you're actually in a calmer state. So withdrawal as a general rule is not a good way to handle conflict. The second way that I've got listed here is conquer, and that's like conquer at all costs. I wrote down a strong-willed person who is hurt or has been frustrated by another person may become determined to win at all costs. And this can result in a shouting match. This can result in you enforcing your view upon people and saying, I'm right and you're wrong, and controlling other people and making people feel small in order to feel like you're in charge, to maintain the ascendancy in the relationship. And any supposed resolution that happens during that time isn't actually lasting resolution, because there hasn't really been healthy conversation take place, and ultimately the person who has been conquered won't feel at peace. And the person who is the conqueror won't have actually grown or changed or learned anything through that. So withdraw is number one, not good. Conquer, number two, not good. Number three that's not good is just to give in. In a relationship where there's been disagreement or conflict, one person may give in order to maintain peace. And it sort of sounds like, oh, okay, I'll just give in to maintain peace. And it sounds like you're being a peacemaker. If it's truly water off a duck's back to you, and if that offence isn't actually causing you any grief, then maybe it's okay to give in. Jesus says things like, if someone wants to strike you on one cheek, turn to them and let them strike you on the other cheek. If someone wants to take your cloak, give them your tunic or whatever as well. There's this place to give in, but not unless you can do it with a free heart. If you can't do it with a free heart, then ultimately what you're doing is you're allowing that bitterness to set root in your life, and no resolution comes from that. And even when Jesus says that about giving in, he's really talking about you, because to give in to another person all the time isn't really helping them. They're just going to get spoiled. So Jesus is teaching you a principle, saying, look, if you can just let stuff go, then that'll help you in your own peace. But it's not necessarily always a healthy way when it comes to resolving conflict. Number four, which is okay, is compromise. And this is where it can be beneficial, because you actually find a point of agreement between the two sides of a disagreement. And you say, well, I'll give and take. I'll take something because I'll give you something. And there becomes like a mediation agreement between the two. So you both get something out of it. It can become a win-win, and you're prepared to trade some stuff off in order to get something else. And that's quite good, and that can be quite healthy. The problem with that method, if that's all you do, is the next time another conflict arises, you're going to have to go through the process again, because you never actually dealt with the underlying emotion that's attached to that situation. All you deal with is the practicalities of what's caused the agreement, the symptoms, if you like, not the cause. But it means that next time there's more symptoms, you'll have to address those symptoms. The fifth way, which is the best way to deal with conflict, is to resolve it, is resolution. And it's the best option. I wrote here, when this method is employed, in a situation, all feelings can be expressed openly in a caring and understanding environment. Core issues can be dealt with, and genuine change and growth can occur. When seeking complete resolution, it's important that you remain focused on the goal of the resolution. You may find some deep feelings come up, but if you can process those and try to avoid getting dragged into past things, but bring them up, share them, then resolving of conflict and emotion and understanding one another and where that person's coming from and where you're coming from, that can all happen in this context. If complete conflict resolution occurs, then both members of this disagreement will actually know each other more intimately, and similar issues will not necessarily cause the same problems in the future. And this is what we call having a pool of meaning. And if you imagine you're sitting across the table from someone in a conflict, and there's a great pool on the table, which is the pool of meaning. That's the reality of what's really going on in that situation. Now, none of us have the full pool of meaning when we start a conflict. You've got your own pool of meaning, and the other person has their pool of meaning. You've got your understanding of what's happened and how it makes you feel, and they've got their own understanding of what's happened and how it makes you feel. And you might disagree with them, and they might disagree with you, but nonetheless, both of you have a pool of meaning. And regardless of who's right and who's wrong, whether half of you're half right and half wrong, or 99% right or 1% wrong, whatever it might be, everyone's perception is their reality and their pool of meaning is what it is. And what we need to do in order to bring conflict resolution effectively is to take our pool of meaning, like imagine it like a handful of cards, and lay them on the table and take time to explain all those cards to the other person. And then they lay their hands on the table and put that into the pool of meaning. And the end result is a pool of meaning that has both their perception and your perception, their hurt and your hurt, your actions and their actions, all on the table, where you can see and embrace and understand the whole thing. And from that, you can actually get healthy conflict resolution. Now, we all react differently to conflict. As I said, there's all these different ways. And what I've done is I've likened it to various different animals, just so that when you have your discussion time, it'll make some sense to you, and you'll be able to have some discussion around this. The first kind of animal that we like to, some of us respond like in a conflict, is like a lion. We attack at all costs to win. We want to win, we'll fight until we win the battle. Others might be like a deer, and a deer, just shoots through. The moment there's a sniff of danger, out, gone. So some of us like to just run away as far as we can from any conflict, avoid it at all costs, and that's not necessarily healthy either. Others of us like to be like an ostrich. We just bury our head in the sand and pretend there's not a problem. We just try and carry on in the relationship, pretending there's not a problem, just completely ignoring the elephant in the room, if you like. Others of us will be like a chameleon. We change our story so that we maintain everyone's good side. So if there's people at conflict, you'll say one thing to someone else, and one thing to one person and one thing to someone else, because you don't want to be entered into conflict. You want to look like the good guy all the time. So you'll change your perception or your story to suit. Others are like an echidna. We get all prickly, buckle down, put up our prickles, and no one can talk to us, no one can interact with us because they know that, well, don't touch that person because they're all prickly right now. And that we keep people at a distance to avoid entering into anything to do with conflict. Others of us can be like an ox. Now, an ox, when it's faced with conflict, it tends to gang up. They try to get other oxen alongside them, because one ox can be picked off by a predator, but you get 2 or 3 or 4 oxen beside each other, and they'll actually fight alongside each other, and they can become a more formidable opponent. And some of us, when we're faced with conflict, more of us than I would like to care for, I'm sure I've done this at times, we try to look for others who will agree with us and take them on our side, and then we can kind of gang up on the predator that's coming to get us. And that's not healthy at all. So a lion, a deer, an ostrich, a chameleon, a echidna, and an oxen. They'll be in your notes, and I want you to discuss those in your connection time. If you have conflict and tension with someone in your world, and I imagine you do, we all do from time to time, and most of the time we've all got someone that there's a bit of tension with at any given time. We just can't ignore it. We can't let it go. It's not healthy to let it go. Even Jesus says that. Jesus says, if you are going to give your gifts on an altar and you remember that someone's got something against you, in other words, you remember there's a tension between you and somebody else, he says, park your gift, leave it on the altar, and go and be reconciled to that person. Then come back and offer your gift. Jesus is saying, hey, if you want to have a relationship with me, if you want to give your life to me, it's going to be very hard to do that if you are out of sorts with someone else. So he places the priority on resolving conflict very high. In John 13:35, Jesus said, by this will everyone know that you're my disciples, that you show love for one another. So the way that we overcome conflict, especially with brothers and sisters in Christ, the way we sort that stuff out actually is a witness and a testimony to people who don't know Jesus. 1 John 4:7 and 8 is very strong. John puts it this way. He says, dear friends, let us continue to love one another, for love comes from God. Anyone who loves is a child of God and knows God. But anyone who does not love does not know God, for God is love. So, if we really say we love God, then we have to love others. If we don't love others, we're lying, and John says the truth is not in us. We're deceiving ourselves. So this whole idea of fighting for resolution is so important. Don't just leave stuff undealt with. Deal with any kind of conflict that you're facing. As far as it depends upon you, the Apostle Paul says, as far as it depends upon you, live at peace with all people. I've talked about this before. How do we do that? Well, we make sure that we have done everything in our power to resolve conflict. Does that mean you'll be able to resolve every conflict? No, because Paul's saying, he acknowledges, he says, as far as it depends upon you. In any kind of conflict, there's at least two people involved, if not more. And Paul's saying, look, you can't be responsible for another person's actions, but you can be responsible for your actions. And even if the other person is 100% wrong, which rarely they are, rarely is a person 100% wrong. Usually we do something wrong. If someone hurts me, I still have to own some of that. But Paul's saying, as far as it depends upon me, Rowan, you have a responsibility to live at peace with everybody. Do everything in my power so my conscience is clear and I know, okay, I've done everything I can do in this situation. My door is open, I've tried, they're not ready to respond, but I don't harbour anything, I've forgiven, and if they want to resolve it, I'll resolve it. If you can't say that, then you haven't done everything in your power to live at peace with all people. All right, so there's some stuff. We're going to look at some discussion questions now, and I encourage you to be very open about this stuff. We all face it. There's no need to be ashamed of it, but take an honest assessment on your life and say, who am I in conflict with? What can I do about it? How do I treat conflict? What sort of animal am I like? Do I deal with it in a healthy way or an unhealthy way? And hopefully, my prayer is that you guys can get some tips and support one another in how you can overcome your conflicts so that you can resolve your conflicts so your relationships can be stronger. All right, well, that's about it for now. So take that stuff away, talk about it, discuss it amongst yourselves, and I pray that it's been encouragement to you.